Experts Insights webinars. I'm your host, Avery Thurman, and today's session is focused on EU CTR compliance and success, navigating updates and preparing submissions for the EU CTIS portal, presented by MMS. As an innovative, data-focused CRO, MMS brings insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. Here to present today is Gina, Clinical Trial Transparency Specialist, Utkarsh, Clinical Trial Transparency Specialist, and Arshi, Team Lead of Regulatory and Medical Writing. As a reminder, your microphones will be muted for the session and we'll send out a recording following the webinar. If you have questions, please ask them at any time in the Q&A icon on the right side of your screen. We'll answer them at the conclusion of today's session. With that, I'll turn it over to the presenters.
Much, Avery, for your introduction, and we're very excited to be sharing this topic with you. It's of great interest as this is a new regulation for everyone worldwide. Today, you can see on the agenda, we're going to just be covering there's a lot that we really could cover, but we had to narrow it down to just a few things for you. Navigating documents such as the PLPS, preparing redacted submissions for the CTIS portal, and a roadmap to, in general, successful CTIS submission. Next slide, please. Our team is really excited to share our experiences with EU CTR CTIS submission process so far. For anyone in attendance who may be unfamiliar, EU CTR is the European Union Clinical Trials Regulation, which began replacing the former EU CTD, or European Union Clinical Trial Directive, on January 31st of 2022. Now, sponsors had 1 year to take part in voluntary submissions under the new regulation before it became required of all sponsors submitting new trial applications as of this past January of 2023. EuCTR is a searchable public website that, by its own definition, aims at creating a more favorable environment for conducting interventional trials in Europe with high standards of safety for study participants and increased transparency of clinical trial information. As part of this new regulation, sponsors who want to conduct a new trial in Europe have to submit their clinical trial applications, or their CTA, through the EuCTR portal that's known as the Clinical Trial Information System, or as we most often refer to it, CTIS. One of the benefits is that CTIS creates a streamlined single entry point for sponsors where they can submit their applications for authorization in up to 30 European countries at the same time, versus the former directive in which sponsors had to submit CTA separately to each individual national competent authority and ethics committee. After the CTA is submitted, they're evaluated by the member states concerned, who issue one of 3 decisions. They either authorize the trial, they authorize it with condition, or the trial is not authorized to proceed. No matter what decision is reached by this MSC, sponsor data will be made available to the public. Of course, not all information is required to be disclosed, because if it was divulged, it would compromise the protection of certain private interests. Since clinical trial documents contain a lot of sensitive information, the sponsor really needs to plan ahead prior to submission and can protect this sensitive information by either applying for deferral or the use of redaction to mask commercially confidential information known as CCI and personal protected data, or PPD. Next slide, please. Now, before we move on, let's take just a minute to conduct a quick poll to find out how many of you attending today have provided support in any way for a clinical trial application under EuCTR. We'll pause and give everybody a chance to respond. So that is interesting to me. I expected that most of the audience would have participated, so it's great to know that we have some people in attendance who can really benefit from this information. Thank you so much for your responses, and please continue if you've not responded yet. At this time, I'm going to hand the presentation over to my colleague Arshi, and she's going to discuss the addition of the PLPS to CTA submissions. Arshi?
Thank you, Gina. While we are navigating document updates, what do we know so far? Regulations and requirements for PLPS. Let's go through the regulations and requirements for PLPS, which includes is to be compliant with EU CTR. Generally, they are used to portray details of clinical study protocols while eliminating most of the technical language, which often creates a barrier in effective public interaction and communication. This will fasten the process of recruitment and development of lay summary results. PLPS is used as a tool in clinical research to help disseminate summarized, easy to digest research information to general public. It lets public look into vital information and chances of feeling overwhelmed as the confusion by surplus information provided is high. Normally, PLPS is available freely on internet and is read as a standalone document, and hence it is necessary that PLPS should summarize a clinical study protocol review in a straightforward style that can be understood by consumers of healthcare. Thus, it becomes important to focus on a clear, factual, unbiased, and comprehensive information being expressed in few words without the usage of jargons. Next slide, please. What are the differences between MHRA and EMA requirements for PLPS? MHRA requires ISR CTN registry, and PLPS should be approximately of 1,000 words, whereas EMA requirements would suggest below. The UK elements include background and study aims, who can participate, what does the study involve, what are the potential risks and benefits, whereas most similar EU CTIS elements include study rationally and objectives and endpoints, trial population, trial design and interventions, and ethical consideration. Next slide, please. As per MHRA requirements, PLPS content includes these sections: background and study aims. This includes brief description of the disease or area of the study and about the objectives and aims of the study. Who can participate? This must include about the age range and gender of the participants, whether they can participate if they have a certain condition or should they be healthy volunteers. What does the study involve? This section should answer a couple of questions like what interventions will be compared? Will all the participants receive the same treatment? What measurements will be taken? To know what are the possible benefits and risks of participant, it should answer the questions like what can participants gain from enrolling into the study? Are there any side effects of the treatment? And if so, what are the symptoms expected? Where is the study run from? This section should illustrate on which institution is managing the study. When is the study starting and how long is it expected to run for? This section must mention about overall start and end dates. Who is funding the study? This section describes about who will be paying the cost that incurs during the life cycle of the trial. Who is the main point of contact? This section should include the name of the main contact and their position they hold at the institution or organization and their email address. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the next slide, which mentions about the points to consider for developing a PLPS. Sponsor should include the following information to be submitted with clinical trial application according to Annexure 1, P24. Sponsor should consider submitting synopsis that's understandable to a layperson. It should be of maximum of 2 pages, which should include the following points, like EU CTN number and protocol title, study rationally, primary and secondary objectives and endpoints, study design, study population, interventions, ethical considerations like benefit and risk assessment. Next slide, please. How different is PLPS from patient information sheet? Patient information sheet is a longer document, while PLPS is a 2-page document. Patient information sheet has a detailed content which includes patient details, study details, payment details, questionnaires, etc. Whereas PLPS is a concise document. Next slide, please. Let's go through the process of development of PLPS and timelines which are applicable. PLPS will be developed after the approval of the protocol. Once the PLPS is approved, it will be sent for redaction. The redacted copy of the PLPS will be sent for translation into a local language. After translation, a secured copy of the protocol will be populated and then will be handed over to the CTIS for submission. Next slide, please. Before we move on, let's take a minute to conduct another quick poll to find out how many of you attending today have understood the PLPS requirement, EU CTR requirement. What is the page limit for a PLPS as per the EU CTR requirement? Equal to 2 pages, more than 2 pages, less than 2 pages. Thank you so much for your responses. I see most of them answering the right answer, that is equal to 2 pages. At MMS, we face many challenges. When we started working on PLPS, we faced many challenges. We have listed few of them for you. Firstly, it had a quick turnaround. We had very few days for drafting. Another challenge was to summarize complex clinical information in few pages. Team review was incomplete due to stringent timelines, because of which data was missed, which led to PLPS amendment. In spite of the process to add 1 reviewer per functional role, many reviewers per functional role were added, which prolonged review time. Delay in review due to various reasons like technical issues with the tool, for example, appearance of error codes in the software, access denial to the tool, etc., were few of the challenges. And there were no backup for resource of out-of-office reviewers. Hence, we had to cancel the reviewer from the team review. Next slide, please. Let's go through the case study of authoring 5 PLPS for a CTI submission in 3 weeks of time. MMS was awarded with a new document type, PLPS. Scope of work was to submit 5 PLPS for same molecule in single submission. There was no room for roundtable with reviewers as it was only 5 days of timeline. To accommodate all the data from the protocol as per the template instructions in 2 pages was another challenge. Lack of guidance on choosing content from protocol, explaining trial design and population in lay language took a lot of efforts. Adding multiple primary and secondary objectives and endpoints in concise manner was not at all an easy task. To overcome these challenges, we worked on 4 documents in parallel using the first approved PLPS as a model. MMS added expertise with the lay language along with the crisp definitions of scales for the endpoints. Peer reviews were included to fine-tune the details. Round-the-clock support was provided to complete the task, and proactive communication through emails and follow-ups was done for expedited review. To fasten the process, 1-person approval was implemented. Finally, we delivered high-quality PLPS in 1 week of time and handed over to the transparency team. Complex study design with the primary and secondary endpoints, approximately 15 to 18 of them, was simplified using lay language. Clinical information was accommodated in 3 to 4 pages, and MMS received a repeated business based on our performance. That is it about the PLPS. Thank you. My colleague Gina will continue with preparing redacted submissions for CTIS portal. Over to you, Gina.
Thank you, Arshi. That was really great information concerning this new document for the submission process. Next, we want to talk to you a little bit about preparing your redacted submissions for the CTIS portal. Next slide, please. Now, under the former directive, sponsors were only required to provide a limited number of documents at the time of application, whereas now under EU CTR, the range of documents, as you can see in this graphic, is much more extensive. For CTIS submissions, the documents are also submitted as a Part 1 and a Part 2 requirement. Next slide. Before we move forward, let's take another quick poll concerning preferences towards deferral versus redaction, which is an option for some of the documents. So do you prefer a deferral option or redaction to protect CCI in EU CTIS submissions? Thank you so much for your answers. Next slide. So some of you may be wondering exactly what is a deferral. We find that most sponsors do prefer the deferral option, which must be applied for during the initial application process. Now, sponsors can apply for deferral for some of the documents during the submission of their initial application. A deferral basically delays the publication of certain documents for a set time period based on the marketing authorization and the phase of the trial. For these deferred documents, CTIS expects little to no redaction. Only PPD and very limited pieces of critical long-standing CCI, which is CCI that can still be considered CCI after the deferral period has lapsed, is allowed. To quote CTIS directly, using simultaneously both CCI redaction and deferral requests for the same document or set of documents equates to over-redaction and will not be acceptable. In this context, it is acknowledged that in limited situations, some pieces of information may still be considered CCI even after the deferral period elapses and consequently would be redacted even in documents subject to deferral request. Next slide. It's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that not all documents can be deferred. Now, this table was taken directly from EMA EU CTR guidance and outlines what documents actually fall under this option. So, as I mentioned earlier, the category and the phase of the trial play into how long the deferral period may last. So, it is a very limited range of documents. Next slide. Now, another way to protect your data in all submitted documents is the use of redaction. PPD, or personal protected data, includes indirect identifiers such as age, race, ethnicity, gender, these are just to name a few, and direct identifiers, which include participant IDs, safety case numbers, names, and handwritten signatures, also just a few examples. And then below that definition, you can see what the redacted overlay for PPD would look like in the public domain. There's an opaque box that would mask the information with an overlay stating that the information is PPD or if it was CCI. CCI, or company confidential information, can include any of the following: excipients, manufacturing details, future development plans, new biomarkers or novel methodologies that are not yet qualified, analytical methods. Again, these are just a few examples of the very broad range of considerations for CCI. And we're going to discuss this a little bit further in the next section of our discussion. Next slide. Now, anytime a new system or way of doing things is implemented, challenges will emerge for sponsors. Let's discuss a few areas that we've identified that, if not taken into consideration, can definitely become pitfalls during a submission. As you can see, this can include new processes, very strict deadlines, which can even impact the need for translation, as mentioned earlier, the ability to correctly identify and protect CCI. Next slide. Now, as far as process considerations during your submission, the beginning is critical. First and foremost, taking time to plan and start the process early is so very important. This builds in time for that inevitable and unexpected that will occur. In the beginning is also a great time to ensure your team understands the scope of the documents that are required. And we saw in that graphic earlier, there's quite a few more documents for the CTIS submission. We rely heavily on the use of trackers surrounding the submission TOC and identified CCI, for instance. We also recommend to work simultaneously on Part 1 and 2 documents, as your timelines are very tight for CTIS and there can be overlapping needs such as translation. As pointed out earlier, there are far more documents included in the application under CTIS, including the brand new ones like PLPS, as Archie discussed. We're also submitting documents such as IBs and DMC charters that were never required before. Because these documents are now eligible for publication, sponsors are having to consider this CCI protection much earlier in the process than before. Also, we suggest looking at the difficulty and the criticality surrounding the protection of data utility within the documents to help dictate exactly where you should begin. Finally, we strongly recommend sponsors consider collaborating with an experienced vendor who can help navigate this entire process. Submission through CTIS really is a coordinated effort that involves the collaboration of a lot of key roles and definition of responsibilities very early on. The expertise that a seasoned vendor can bring, utilizing their experience, can truly make the difference and result in a more streamlined and less stressful experience for everyone involved. They can help sponsors facilitate clear communication among their own key players as well as the CTIS members. Next slide, please. Another challenging aspect, as we mentioned earlier, can be how to best handle this redaction of CCI. It's only natural to want to protect as much data utility as possible. However, one of the most common pitfalls we see pertaining to CCI is over-redaction. Many sponsors choose to blanket entire sentences, paragraphs, tables, figures, and entire sections within their data. And while that's understandable, the reality is that regulators expect targeted redaction of this information. Since this is being considered so early in the process, we have to really step back and ask ourselves what is critical to mask, not just at this moment in the very beginning, but what's going to be long-standing CCI after the completion of the trial. While this information may be unpublished right now, the likelihood is very great that much of this information will gradually make its way into the public domain over the course of the trial and even after. As a vendor who's worked with many sponsors identifying CCI, we take the time to train our sponsor submission teams on both what generally will fall under the umbrella of CCI, as well as how to identify and target that information. We'll help our sponsors by running public domain searches of the information, as well as utilizing sponsor-provided documents such as presentations, articles, and other documents they can provide for us.
Thank you, Gina.
We also encourage sponsors to
continue to
engage their
understand another
SMEs,
challenge
such as
we noted while
statistical
working on
and
CTIS
international
submission,
patent law
that is
teams,
the
for
timelines.
example, to weigh in on
Timelines
the
around RFIs are
identification
tough.
of targeted
We have 10
CCI.
calendar days
Coordinating
to
these
respond to
SME
RFI during
experts for this
validation
submission
phase
to
and
help
12
identify the
days in
CCI is
part 1 and
critically
part 2
important.
assessment phase.
Any information
There
that
can be
remains
multiple rounds of
unredacted and is
RFIs.
released publicly
If we
can
receive
no
a
longer be
subsequent
considered
RFI to
CCI
the
for
original
any
one,
future
the
submissions.
timeline
Together, we can
for
help
the
them narrow
RFI
down the
shortens, and it
information
can
that is
be as
temporarily
short as
CCI at the
48 hours to
beginning
respond.
versus what's going to be that
During this
long-standing
expedited
CCI
request,
long after the
we
trial
should
is
limit the
completed.
number of
Our common goal
reviewers
is
for
to
the
protect this
updated
critical
document,
data that could
and in
have
this way we
far-reaching
can cut
impact for
down
our
the
sponsors
response time.
while abiding by the
To
regulatory
meet the
guidance to
timelines, we
minimize
can
and
always
protect
start
as much
by
data
resource
utility for the
planning.
public as possible.
RFIs need a
Next slide.
targeted team effort.
Well, let's look at a quick case
Biostat
study where
teams,
we were able to help
medical writing
a new
teams have to
sponsor
work
streamline the
closely
CTIS
with the
process.
transparency team
The sponsor
to
came to
understand
us,
the
they were
transparency
unfamiliar,
requirements of
and
the
they were
document.
very overwhelmed with CTIS
As a best
requirements, which is
practice, we
understandable. And we
always
were able to
plan an
guide them
alignment
through
meeting before
identification of their
initiating the
in-scope
RFI
documents.
updates
We helped
to
develop a
clarify the
solid
roles and
strategy for all the
responsibilities.
tasks involved with submission, including
Timelines should be
transition trials and
clearly noted
prospective
in the
studies.
discussion
We
with the team.
collaborated on
That helps a
defining
lot.
their PPD rules,
Next slide, please.
developing appropriate QC checklists, and a CCI tracker, among other
So on this
things.
note, let's
We
look
also
at another case study.
provided
this
further
case study
ad
talks
hoc
about
support by
RFI handling.
providing a project management
For a small pharma,
support
when we
piece.
started working
We
on
helped
RFI
identify
requests, we noted
responsibilities
that
for both the sponsor
experienced
review team and our
resources were not
transparency
available
team.
to address the
And we
RFI.
worked with them very
There
early
was
on to
no
identify
synergy
the
between
needs
the
around standard
different
and
teams at
expedited
the sponsor
timelines.
end.
Finally, we were able to
Soon the
help
team
guide them through the
received a
challenging
subsequent
CCI
RFI to the
process by
existing one
coordinating
with a
with their
critical
sponsor
timeline.
SMEs for
So when
verification of the
we
information.
were assigned to this
We
situation. MMS
provided cross-functional
project management
communication
support to
and
the sponsor
alignment through use of
and conducted
trackers and
RFI
comment
alignment
resolution
meetings.
meetings. And
We
we help the
alerted
sponsor
MMS
better
global
understand
team
the
on the
EMA criteria
requirements
for
of the
protection
submission.
information in those deferred
Global team
documents we
worked
discussed
round the
earlier.
clock to get the
At this
impacted
time, I'm going to
documents
hand the
updated
presentation
and
over to my
redacted on
colleague
time.
Utkarsh, who's going to continue
Sponsor
the
team
discussion
completed
on
the response within
more of the
48
CTIS
hours and
challenges and
finally
pitfalls.
finished the CTIS
Utkarsh?
submission. A successful submission. Next slide, please. Along with the CCI's handling, process efficiency, shrinking timelines, another struggle in front of sponsors are to manage the translation of documents in local language and redacting such versions. With the translation need, sponsor needs to understand three main things. First, shortlist the documents to be translated. Second, hire a reliable translation partner. And third, watch the timelines closely. Soon after the CTIS launch, translation partners are keeping busy. The best translation vendor is the one who can assure us the right quality and quick turnaround. While doing so, we need to focus on the correct set of documents to be shared with the translation team. Reach out to the local sites for availability of previously translated versions of the documents and check for the language requirement based on country level CTA filings. Authenticity of the translation is guaranteed with the quality certificates. These quality certificates are required for audit purposes. Collecting them on time from the translation partner offers a smooth audit experience. Next slide, please. Now let me share with you a case study where MMS helped the sponsor with translation and reduction of in-scope documents. So sponsor had 4 active studies for CTIS across the year and a good pool of documents that needed translation. The submission deadlines were being shifted due to availability of Part 1, Part 2 documents that needed translation followed by reduction. MMS identified key process steps between MMS, translation partner, and the sponsor. We helped to align the communication between the vendor and the sponsor stakeholders and got the documents translated within the stipulated timeline. MMS scrutinized the in-scope documents for actual translation needs, bringing down the number of documents in scope for translation to only 3 from previously projected 160 documents included in the CTA. Hence, MMS helped the sponsor to save a significant cost on translation services as well. Next slide, please. With these case studies from transparencies and PLPSs, you must have understood the importance of partnering with an experienced CRO. So let's look at few more points which makes this partnership with MMS even more meaningful and makes us, the MMS, a preferable partner for a collaborative effort on CTIS submission. Next slide, please. Yeah. This process workflow depicts the functional lines of integration that is needed for successful CTIS submission. Data and documents are collected from the sponsor. RO drives the submission process that typically includes content plan creation, data and document collection, document publishing, submission related activities such as compilation, QC, and dispatch. As any other regulatory submission, we need to do this hand in hand with the regulatory strategy teams with inputs on submissions such as country selection, data, and responses to RFIs. We partner with medical writing team on procuring the correct set of documents and any updated versions prepared in response to RFIs. Transparency has been built as default in design with CTIS. So as you all know, most of the data and the documents will be made publicly available based on approved deferral window. Hence, coordination with the transparency team on public and or anonymized document is needed at every step of the submission. Lastly, we need to take into account that translation document is performed prior CTA build. Next slide, please. Now the question is, even after deploying a cross-functional team, how we can streamline the process of CTIS submission. Regulatory Affairs team will develop the strategy, project plan, and scope of documents for the CTA based on timelines at hand and for new and translation trials from CTT to CTR. Medical writers can help the team to avoid redundant use of probable, confidential, and personal information in the submission documents using lean writing principles. Avoiding the use of PPDs like subject IDs in the documents where we can present the information in a summarized way should be practiced. Transparency can conduct sessions for the sponsors in understanding the concept of CCIs, which will curb over redaction and rework. We need to develop a clear approach of temporary versus long-standing CCIs in case of deferred documents. Long-standing CCIs can only be marked in deferred documents, which will remain redacted even after the deferral period gets over. Temporary CCIs can be a target in a non-deferred document. Those can be CCIs for now, but not for a long term. We can keep data ready on electronic database as soon as it is ready for submission. We suggest starting the submission activities 3 months in advance, considering planning, scoping, authoring, redaction, and translation of the documents for CTIS submission. We can prioritize the documents based on page count and data complexity. Higher number of pages and complex documents call for an early start. So I guess with this, now I pass on the baton to Gina once again, as she will walk you through the best practices for completing a successful submission in view of transparency activities. Over to you, Gina. Thank you.
Thanks, Ukarsh. Yeah, it's very, very important to utilize these cross-functional teams for transparency and to educate your sponsors on the protection of the CCI and the PPD. This data can be maintained on an electronic database, and the sponsor can start making a list of documents and keep them ready to upload well in advance of the submission. An ideal time would be 3 months in advance to begin the redaction work and assessment of the documents, and the documents can then be prioritized as per the page and data complexity. Next slide, please. So finally, we're at the end, and we're going to discuss what is, in finality, the roadmap to a successful CTIS submission. Next slide. In closing, our goal today really was to help everyone create the most successful environment for your CTIS submissions by sharing our experiences and our lessons learned along the way. Following these actions items has helped our team guide many successful EuCTR projects so far. To summarize, we suggest to implement the following strategies prior to the application. 1, identify the scope of your submission documents. Decide on deferral versus redaction approach for those eligible documents. Translation, what will be the requirements for your documents, and to build in the necessary time needed for this part. Train everyone who will work on the submission about CTIS requirements and their expectations, including CCI training for SMEs, and even the need for lean writing for your medical writing team. RFIs, plan in advance, plan, and be prepared for how those will be approached. They are strictly time-bound. For the PLPS, do you have a prepared template and your medical writers are ready to meet the regulatory requirements of this new document? It's critical to develop both a process and a timeline in advance for all of these steps. So by acting early and planning well, the CTIS process is well within everyone's reach to experience both the smooth and rewarding, and most of all, successful experience navigating this EuCTR process. I just want to thank everyone so much for your time and your attendance. And at this time, I'm going to hand it back over to Avery to facilitate any questions from our
That's a good
attendees.
question.
Thank you all to the
There are several
presenters for
key
your
factors
insights,
that
and
we
now we're
presented
going
in
to
this
move
webinar
on
today.
to the
So
Q&A portion
I feel
of the
the most
webinar.
crucial all of them is
The first
concept of
submitted
CCIs,
question we
understanding
have
the
is,
concept of
how do you
CCIs.
think the
Because
upcoming
the real struggle
Policy
is
70
to find a
relaunch will
perfect blend
impact
of
the
well-justified
EuCTR
CCI in the
submissions?
submission documents. And handling CCIs
Well,
is
this
a
is
big
a really great
responsibility with the
question,
review
and
team.
it's one
So we
that
suggest
our team
conducting a
has
small
really had a lot of
session
discussion
for the review team
around.
at least around the
And
CCI
honestly, for right
criteria,
now, it's a little hard to
and
tell.
regulators accept
The
minimal
EMA
CCIs, so
recently
that
held a
you need to
meeting
keep in mind.
in May concerning the
I would
relaunch
also
of
suggest
Policy
to decide a
70. And for those of you who
strategy
don't
early
know,
on deferral
EMA
friendly
stepped
documents,
away for
as
a
in if you're
while
going
during
for a
Brexit, and then of
deferral or
course
a
we had
reduction of
the
the CCI
pandemic, which
details.
slowed
We need to
their
finalize it at the
restarting
very start of the
submission or
submission.
accepting trial submissions.
Next
And
thing
it really left all of
would
us
be to
questioning whether
craft a
Policy 70
well-communicated
would
roles and
continue on as
responsibilities
is,
chart,
or
maybe something like a
would
RASI
the
matrix.
collaboration that was
This
occurring
will give
between
a
Health
clarity to
Canada and
stakeholders.
other regulatory
What are their
agencies
roles
with
and
EMA
what
going
are the
to change this
timelines and
Policy 70?
how we can
So it
actively
seems
get
from this
involved in that
meeting that occurred in
process.
May that there's a
Preparing
group from
for
CTIS and EMA Policy
probable
70
RFIs
currently
during
working
the
on a guidance
submission also
document that's
helps.
going to elaborate further on
And keep the team on
their
standby
ideas
mode
surrounding
if any
CCI
super
and anonymization
pressing
of
need
these
arises
documents. So
during the entire
right now,
process. So
aligning
we need
these
to
two
keep the
seem to be
team
their
on
major aim.
very standby mode, and
I think
several
it seems
of the other
logical for now that
steps
CTIS
we
documents
can follow.
should
But
follow
these are the
Policy
key
70
steps that
redaction
helped
rules
us to
for
manage the
PPD
CTIS submission
until
lately.
we hear
I feel
further.
you can
For
definitely think on
CCI,
these
the main
lines as a
factor has
starting point.
always been and always will
Thanks.
be if the information is already in the public domain or will become available over the course of the trial. In that case, it cannot be considered CCI in any regulatory manner. So we think the fate of Policy 70 and its connection to CTIS will be an evolutionary process as we move forward.
Okay, another question we have submitted is, what points should the sponsor team be aware of at the start of any CTIS submission? Okay, we have another submitted question. Is PLPS a mandatory document to be submitted, and has MMS experienced RFIs if the PLPS is not submitted?
Hi, thank you for this
Again, this
question.
is my favorite topic.
Yes,
I'll take this one.
PLPS is mandatory as per the EU CTR, but as
I
it
can
is
say
not being
that we
made
have
as a
seen
mandatory
maximum numbers
document to
of
be submitted along
RFIs
with the
around
ICF.
endpoints clarification, asking for better demarcation and
I hope this
segregation of the
answers the question.
endpoints. In
Okay,
another
we have
case, I
time for a
remember
couple
working
more,
on
so I'll continue
RFI
reading the
around projected
submissions.
CTIs, which is rare,
Can you
which was the
elaborate
need
on
of the
transitional
submission.
trials under
So we maintained
CTIS?
the markup as targeted as possible.
Sure,
Sponsors
I'll
have
take
been
this one.
requested to add interim
So transitional
data
trials are
analysis
those ongoing
of the
trials that
results
were approved
in the
under
IBs
the EU
specifically,
Clinical Trial
and we have
Directive
observed the
through
RFIs on the study
EudraCT.
design
And this
as
was
well.
the application was
Even if
made
the
prior to the beginning of
RFI
CTIS in
processed
January of
document will not
2022.
have much
So
to redact
the
on a
previous
new information
authorizations
added,
do not
but we
expire
need to mirror
under
the reductions
EudraCT
from the
unless there was
previous
no patient
version
recruitment
to the
within 2
current one.
years.
So
These
I feel
trials that
as we
were
move
authorized
forward
under
with the submission, we
CTD
can collect the
and are
trends on a
foreseen not to
submission
end
level pattern
by
and can
2025,
work on them for
the
the
end of
next
January
submission to minimize the
2025.
queries from
They
ENT.
have to meet these following
I
criteria
guess
to
that
be
answers the
transitioned. They have
questions.
to be
Thank you.
interventional trials in humans. They have to have at least one site in the EU that's still ongoing, and the trial is not on hold, or notification of the trial end has not been submitted. And going back to a previous point in the webinar, sponsors need to be planning a solid transition strategy for these transitional trials now, and definitely not wait until the end of that 3-year transitional period. They do have that 3 years to transition these fully over to the new system. And we know that all transfer documents must comply with the EuCTR standards. However, any new documents that were not required under the former directive, such as the PLPS, the sponsor may upload like a blank document in its place. So you don't have to go back and recreate that document if you started the application under EudraCT. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and we'll do one more. So what RFI trends have you noticed on submitted documents? Okay, perfect. Thank you to those who submitted questions, and any questions we did not have time to answer today, we'll follow up with you directly. If you have any additional questions about what you heard, please email media@mmsholdings.com and we'll direct you to a presenter. For additional free webinars, visit mmsholdings.com/webinars or follow us on LinkedIn for updates. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.